Hello, everyone. Andrew Solar-Greco here with the UUP Stony Brook Oral History Project. I'm joined today by Michael Zweig, Professor Emeritus in the Economics Department. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. This is a very good project.
Absolutely. Thank you. So when did you begin working at Stony Brook?
I came to Stony Brook in September 1967. I was hired out of the University of Michigan, where I got a PhD in economics in 1967. And Bob LeCashman, who was in the economics department then, he was the chair of the economics department, hired me. They hired me to be a radical. I was already, part of what became the Union for Radical Political Economics. We were challenging the core of the mainstream economics, and that was something that seemed attractive to LeCashman, and so he hired me.
So that was a formal organization, or more?
It became Union for Radical Political Economics, that we called UUP, or UUP later on. That was a real organization,
and it was within academia.
Well, no, it was some academics. It was some people who were interested in doing economics research, but they weren't academics. Feminist people who were thinking about feminist economics before there was such a thing, and we were trying to understand those issues of how the economy treats women and women's labor in the home and into the workplace. All those issues were part of what we were trying to understand. And I got hired here to do that.
Great. And it sounds like, 1969, that's 4 years before UUP was formed. So
1967.
1967.
6 years before.
Wow.
UUP was
Okay.
formed, right?
So what was it like to work here before there was a union?
Well, it was a new university. It was growing. It was very kind of yeasty atmosphere. There was a lot of young people, a lot of people who had very strong ideas about the importance of public education and public higher education. So that was all good. But we ran into a lot of problems with administration about daycare and childcare, setting up a childcare center. A lot of problems around Black studies and bringing Black students here and what would be involved in that. So those were all issues that were very much front and center. And of course, among the students, there was a lot of work around the war, and we did some of that too in the faculty in conjunction with the student movement, challenging Defense Department research here on campus. And those were the kinds of social issues that we were dealing with as a faculty. And those were not the same issues that emerged in the union campaign, but globally they were the same because it was a question of social justice and economic justice for the world and for us.
And that was a real tinderbox of political moment in the late 60s.
Very much so.
So what was the initial unionization drive like?
The initial unionization drive really started with professionals who had union experience in their jobs before they came to work at a university. And so there was some appreciation there already for unions that was way beyond what faculty understanding was at the time. And there were a whole lot of machinations that were going on at the state level, state professional association, SPA, and there were other things that I was not part of. But there came a time in the 72, 73 when there was a real question about, are we going to have a union? And what would be the bargaining unit? How broad would it be? Those were issues that came up before PERB, the Public Employees Relations Board, and PERB decided that the bargaining unit would include all the professional employees, but not the CSEA level employees, but what is now the professional and academic and library, which is part of the academic constituencies in SUNY, and that became the bargaining unit. And then there was the question of, do we want a union? And that's really where I got more involved. It's, yes, we want a union, but then which union? Because there was an election under PERB rules, and the faculty and the professional staff all had to vote. It was a ballot. And on the ballot was being an AFT local, being an NEA local, National Education Association, AAUP, and no union. Those were the choices. And in my view, the answer ought to be the AFT, because the AFT was most close to being a union. The NEA presented itself as a professional association. The AAUP didn't even do collective bargaining at the time. They do now, but they didn't then. And the AAUP presented itself as an academic freedom organization, which was, of course, very important, but that wasn't collective bargaining. And I thought at the time, and argued very strongly among my colleagues and all kinds of people wherever the question came up, we should be an AFT local, because we should be as closely connected to the broad labor movement as we could possibly be. And the AFT was part of the AFL-CIO. It's part of the main labor movement in the US. That's where our allies are, or could be. That's where our organizational strength will come from. And so that's where we should be. And we should not think of ourselves as sort of professionals above the workforce. That's the union. That's who gets into unions. We're not that. And I was arguing very strongly that we are that. And if we're not that in any direct, immediate way in our jobs, because we do have more authority and autonomy as academics than professionals, our future as academics is totally tied up with the strength of the general labor movement in defending public higher education. So that was even a question then. And that's the argument that won the day.
So how close was the vote?
I don't remember.
Yeah.
I don't remember, but I do know that there were people who became active in UUP, like Joel Rosenthal, who was the AAUP representative on campus, and was arguing that we should be part of the AAUP, just because of the importance of academic freedom. So, when that went the other way and we were an AFT local, Joel was fine to work very closely with UUP, and he's been a very stalwart force all from the beginning to the end.
That's great. So we're affiliated now with NEA. So that affiliation came further down.
That came later. That's because it's nice that New York State United Teachers.
Correct.
And what the United Teachers was bringing the AFT locals and the NEA locals together into one entity, and that's nice.
Got it. Okay, great. So we had this early unionization. Was there, this unionization in 1973? Was there great enthusiasm in those early years? What were some of the challenges faced then, and are they comparable to some of the challenges we may face now?
Well, in the early years, once the election happened and there was UUP, I was not that involved in it. I was glad I was there, but I was not particularly active in the union until around 1980.
Yeah.
I was doing other things. I was involved in the Maoist sort of communist left, and that was taking me into other priorities, not contradictory to the union, but just other things to do.
Sure.
And so in those early years of UUP, I don't have a whole lot of direct experience.
But I mean, in the very, very early years, like in 1973, you were presumably going around and, like you said, advocating for folks to vote for the AFD affiliation.
Oh, absolutely. And there was resistance among faculty. What do we need a union for? We're not workers.
Yeah.
We don't want to be associated with workers. And then that reflected some in the split about why do we have professional employees in the same bargaining unit. So there was some reluctances and hesitancies about that. And I just argued, well, there's unity and strength.
Yeah.
Of strength and unity, and that's where we should be.
So you had that first experience there where you helped organize the union shop in the first place.
Yes.
But then you said you got more involved in around the early 80s or so.
That's
So what does that early involvement look like? And what roles did you hold in leadership within the chapter?
Well, in the chapter, at some point in there, I got to be vice president for academics. And I was vice president for academics for a number of years. And then set that aside for other people. And then I came back and was there for another 8 years. So I was vice president for academics for a long time. And in that capacity, working to develop other academic involvement in the union. And we had different initiatives that tried to do that in different ways. So I was that. And then I was a delegate to the Albany Delegate Assemblies. And I remember the first DA that I went to, I guess it must have been 1980 or 1981, Nuala Drescher was the president. She'd just been elected. And I didn't really know what I was getting into. I had a three-piece suit on.
Yeah.
I went up with a three-piece suit because this is, the top of the labor movement here, you've got to be a little spiffy the way that these people present themselves. And Nuala had brought in a person who was talking about this book that he'd written, I'm Okay, You're Okay. And I just thought it was this craziest thing I ever heard. What does this mean? I'm okay, you're okay. This is a union. We're a fighting force. We're not okay, and they're not okay. We have our grievances and we have things we have to get straight. And we're up against a power that we have to take down. So what is this I'm okay, you're okay stuff? So that
What was it about?
well, it was about conciliation and being nice and
Fostering good relations,
good
labor
with
management.
that's right, that kind of thing, and conflict resolution in kinds of ways of approaching things. And I was pretty distressed by that as an organization, but I kept going and I kept being involved, and I guess in the early 1990s, Bill Scheuermann was president, and I went to Bill and I said, we ought to have some way to connect UUP to the larger labor movement and to the larger social questions of the day. So we should have a committee that does that. And let's call that committee Labor and Higher Education. And Bill agreed. And we've worked out that we would have such a committee, and it would not be the same as the Solidarity Committee. It would be a committee that would actually try to mobilize UUP for broad social movement purposes, whereas the Solidarity Committee was more, let's give some money to struggles that are important. And they had a budget, and I was part of that committee too. And we would meet and we would say, okay, here's a struggle, we should give $300 here, $500 there. But the labor and higher education was a different thing. This was to really engage UUP. And we worked on questions there of trying to unite all the different unions in higher education, which was AFSCME, it was UAW, PEF, AFT, and I was involved with others in that committee, pulling together a thing like that on a national scale. And UUP participated in that for a time. Larry Gold was the staff member at AFT for higher education. As a staff member, you're not supposed to get involved in politics, in the internal politics of the union, you're just a staff. So, because this was organizing all across different unions, Larry was involved. And there was at the time an organization called, with the unfortunate name, Scholars, Artists, and Writers for Social Justice, SAWSJ, pronounced sausage. So, if you got an organization named Sausage, it's got to be doing something to
amalgam of things squished together.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't a union, but it was what it said: Scholars, Artists, and Writers for Social Justice. And I worked very closely with them, and with these other unions, we got together to form, I forget what we called it, but some large coalition of higher ed labor. And Larry Gold, I think we had the first meeting of that in 1999. And Larry said it was the best piece of organizing he ever saw. So I was pleased because I was sort of partly the center of that.
So you said staff got involved?
No, he was just looking it over.
Okay.
And just trying to say, okay, and here's some resources, or here, that kind of thing, and monitoring it. But he was not actively involved in trying to push it forward politically and get involved in the internal political dynamics of all the different groups and unions. So we did that, and that went on for a little while, and then that kind of dissipated.
I was gonna say, I don't think something like that exists right now.
Well, it's interesting because Fred Cole wanted to revive it. And I went down, and Fred invited me to come down to a broad AFT higher ed conference to reflect on this and to talk about it. There was a lot of interest. And then Fred actually did put something together with other unions, but he didn't involve me. So I don't really know what happened there or what it's actually doing, if anything. But I do know that he did announce last year that there was such a thing again.
Yeah.
So that's another example of trying to get UUP involved with other unions.
Yeah.
The way that we've done here and you've done with the local around parking issues or other questions, getting all the different unions on campus.
A labor council.
A labor council.
Yeah, I think a labor council at the state level would be very productive to have, because we work alongside FCSCA, GSU, et cetera, all these other unions on a regular basis. CSCA. Yeah. Okay, that's great. So was there a kind of major battle, win or lose, that you were a part of with the administration at some point over your career as an active employee?
Yeah, there were a lot of them. Well, there was a huge fight about daycare, getting the daycare center set up. There was quite a substantial fight within labor management discussion about library policy in response to the what was that law called in 2002, the National Security Act, where they were going to go and have all your library records. And the FBI could come to a library and say, we want to know who Joe Blow was reading, all the records of what books. And we said here, and there was a campaign all over the country in higher education and among librarians in general, to not cooperate with that or to resist it. So we, through the union here, took that up to, at that time was Shirley Kenny, who was president, and I was vice president for academics, so I was part of these discussions and meeting outside of the labor management meetings with the head of the library, the dean of the library. And we were saying, you have to discard all records within 2 weeks of when the material is returned, so that if you get asked, you just don't have them. You don't have the records. It isn't you're saying you can't see the records.
Yeah.
We don't have them. We don't keep those records. Well, the librarian didn't want to do that. The dean of the library absolutely refused. And we took it up at labor management, and Shirley said, Humph take it up with the dean. And we went back and forth. And finally, we had a meeting, a labor management meeting, in which we asked Shirley to invite the dean of the library to that meeting. And we presented our case to Shirley Kenny, president of the university, and said, we don't think that the library should hold these records. And Shirley turned to the librarian, the dean of the library, and said, well, what's the problem? And the dean of the library said, well, faculty sometimes want to know what it is that, for their references, if they're writing an article and they want this citation, they want to come back and say, well, what was that book or what was that article? And so we have to keep the records. And Shirley said, well, in my day, if we used library resources, we took notes.
Yeah.
Stop this policy right now. And that was the end of that policy. He did stop it.
That's good.
But that was, a bit of a tussle. We had another tussle also with Shirley about workload issues, where there was deans that were trying to assess the research output of faculty, and if it wasn't adequate in the dean's judgment, that they would be given extra courses to teach.
Yeah. That sounds like post-tenure review.
Well, yeah, but it wasn't called post-tenure review. It was just, if you're not doing research, this is a research one university.
Yeah.
If you're not doing research or adequate amounts of research, we're going to, then your workload should be a full workload. You'll be teaching more. And we said, well, that essentially is using teaching as a punishment.
Yeah.
And that is not the kind of approach we want as an institution to teaching. And Shirley finally said, that's right. And she put a stop to it. But there was one guy in particular who was subject to this policy that was very unfair. He'd been an assistant professor, but he didn't publish enough, so he went back to being a lecturer. So he was on repeated term appointments, and he'd been here for many, many, many years. And it was just, and he was a fantastic teacher. He was just great, but he wasn't getting tenure. He wasn't allowed under the way. So Shirley called me when that meeting was over. Shirley called me into the back to her office and said, I want to talk to you about this. I think you're talking about XY person. Is that right? And I said, well, no, we're talking about this thing more generally, but yes, for XY person. And she said, well, bring me the file for XY person's promotion and I'll take care of it. And we did, and she did.
So he got
absolutely
tenure.
Promoted to associate professor, from lecturer to associate professor with tenure. And that was, the union did that.
Yeah.
And it wasn't through agreements, it was through looking at what is the orientation of the institution towards the academic mission. And we were able to bring that in a way through labor management that the Senate doesn't really have that channel. They have other channels, but they don't have that. And so those were, examples. We also had big fights about, well, early on, even before there was UUP, we had big fights about Black studies and bringing Black students onto the campus. For the record, I think that it'd be useful for people to know, in the late 1960s, there was a big campaign all over the country for Black studies and to bring Black students into higher education, and particularly premier institutions of higher education.
Is that like a broader extent of the Black arts movement?
Well, it wasn't just Black arts, but it was just more generally, why aren't we training African-American students in institutions of higher education in the United States? It's outrageous. And here was this whole civil rights movement trying to integrate the schools and integrate the housing and integrate this and integrate that. Well, what about higher education? Let's bring some Black students.
So you're saying at the time the student body was
all white.
All white.
Yeah, basically white. So
and this is before EOP and before
way before that. EOP, Economic Opportunity Program.
Yeah.
So John Toll was president of the university. This was like in 1968, 69, way before the union. But in the midst of all this uproar that was going on all over the country. And at that time, students and faculty were arguing we should have Black students be brought on the campus. And finally, Toll said, okay, we'll have a program, the Special Opportunities Program. Well, what are the initials of Special Opportunities Program?
SOP.
SOP. It was the SOP program.
Yeah.
So that
acronyms today I'm hearing.
Yeah, well, so we said, all right, well, we're going to bring the Black students, but what kind of financial aid are we going to have? And Toll said, okay, here's the financial aid. At the time, we had financial aid for other students, for all students, it was possible if you met certain criteria. But there was a rule that freshmen would not be given work study because they had enough problems just orienting themselves to being in college that they should just devote themselves to that and not have to worry about showing up for a job. That was the thinking. And I thought that was sound, and we all thought fine. Well, Toll says, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to make an exception for Black students, and they're going to get work study. So we said, wait a second, there's a policy. Why? No, they shouldn't get work study. And he said, and he really did say this. He said, well, the reason why they should have work study is when they fail, when they flunk out, at least they'll have work experience. So that was kind of the,
Well, and that's atrocious. But even just then, this notion that, a certain demographic of the student body should be expected to dare I say, work for free compared to the rest. I mean, that looks really bad.
Well, the whole thing was just upside down. So, that was the environment. But then even among the faculty and progressive and liberal faculty, there was resistance to the idea of Black studies because the thinking was, and this was again something that, like Bob Cashman, who hired me to be a radical in the economics department, he was himself quite, radical, anti-establishment, economic establishment type guy. Well, he and other people argued, what's Black studies? What's Black history? It's just a history of degradation. Why should we ask people to study their own degradation? We should give them the culture, Western advanced culture and technology and literature and the arts that are uplifting.
Yeah.
And so that was a whole kind of intellectual argument and political argument about, the history of oppression, and is it just something that should be hidden from people, or is there a story there of courage and of resiliency and imagination and creativity in the midst of all of that horrible oppression? And so those are the kinds of arguments that were going on, sort of intellectual arguments, which is interesting. And just for the record, let it be known that that was going on even before there was a union here. And when we got going, and the UUP was, of course, now part of AFT. Well, Al Shanker was the president of AFT, American Federation of Teachers nationwide. He had been president of the UFT, United Federation of Teachers in New York City, and then became president of the AFT nationally. So in the middle 1980s, this question of race came up came up in Ocean Hill-Brownsville and community control of the schools in New York City in 1968, when the teachers went on strike because Black parents wanted more control over the schools for what their children were learning. And the teachers union said, no, we're in charge of the schools. And we don't want teachers coming. Well, it turned into a racial thing, because it was Black parents that were asking for this and not white parents. Yeah. And it was white teachers and who were saying, no, we want control of the classroom. So all the substantive issues of what's being taught and what's not being taught and who's teaching and what goes on in the classroom all got disappeared, and all became white versus Black. It all became a race question. And Al Shanker was on the white side of that race issue when he was president of UFT. Well, now we can fast forward another 15 years, and here we are in the AFT nationally, and I'm a delegate to the AFT convention with, Judy Wishney and bunches of other people. We go. And there's a question about apartheid. And there's a question of, do we support the boycott and the turning of South Africa into a pariah, and support the ANC and support Nelson Mandela? Well, no, we're not going to support Nelson Mandela is a communist. Don't you know that? We're not supporting any communists, goddamn communists. The hell with them. We're going to support this other guy. Forget his name. It was a minister in Philadelphia who was associated with some anti-communist formation in South Africa, of course, all Black, that were talking about reform and engagement kind of policies, which was Reagan's engagement. And we came into the AFT conventions, armed with resolutions to go and challenge apartheid through support for the ANC and Mandela, free Nelson Mandela and all that stuff. And Shanker wouldn't have any. And of course, he ran a tight ship, a very, very, very tight ship. And so, he had people at every microphone. And I remember getting up to speak. I got to a microphone, I got to recognized, and they knew who I was. And they had their goons around the microphones, and they just pushed me aside.
How do you get recognized to speak and then get pushed aside?
I forget exactly how that worked.
I
I forget exactly how that went. But later on, we can now go fast forward to an AFT convention with Randy in charge. There was a resolution that I had just been to Korea with John Braxton from Philadelphia Community College, also AFT. And John and I came to the AFT convention with a resolution, and we got the resolution, to support the Koreans and all this peace movement in Korea, unified Korea, get the U.S. military out, no more armistice, let's have a peace treaty. This was just a few years ago, I think in 2019. And there, Leo Casey got up and he gave like the shortest speech ever. I mean, he was quite a loquacious guy. And he got up and when the resolution came up, and he said, "This is a good resolution, I'm all for it." Just so that there was no debate. And John and I were at different microphones in order to debate, to bring forward ideas in the purpose of the resolution. And they weren't having it.
So who was Leo? I'm sorry, was he the
Leo
secretary
Casey?
treasurer?
No, Leo Casey was, he now is in charge of the Albert Shanker Institute.
Okay.
But he was a high-level official at the UFT in New York.
Got it.
And was in charge of their high school division.
Well, I mean, in this specific context, he was just.
Oh, well, he was one of the leading lights of the UFT delegation,
Yeah.
700 delegates,
Yeah.
to a convention with 2,000 or 225 delegates. They control what goes
Absolutely.
on. And everybody looks to Leo for what to say and what to think. So Leo gets up and says, "This is a great resolution. I'm all for it." And he sits down. Right. And John is in another mic and he gets recognized. But then there's a point of order, and the captain of that microphone says no, and he can't be there. So he's pushed aside. I'm next at the next microphone, and the guy who's in charge of the microphone, even though I was first in line, says, "No, you're not first in line. This other guy's first in line," who gets in and calls the question, right? So I'm just furious, just livid. And I just jump up and start making big noises about point of order. Why are you closing down the microphones? I challenge Randy. This is outrageous. We have a motion. We should debate this. We want to say something about this. Well, what she did was she said, "Well, okay, we're moving to a vote, but I'm sending one of her apparatchiks to talk to you right now about what we can do to get this information out to the members on our blog, on the website." And so we moved to a vote, and of course, everybody voted for this great resolution, but without any discussion.
Yeah.
So that there was no educational opportunity. Yeah. And then John and I were offered the opportunity to write a 900-word blog post for the AFT blog, which we did, and it got posted, and God knows who read it, or what happened because they read it. But that's the kind of thing. This is a very top-down, very, very tightly organized operation. Now, Shanker was a very interesting guy. I remember being at a AFT convention in the middle 1980s. I don't know if it was the same one where this question came up about Mandela, but he was talking about charter schools. And he said, people are complaining about the quality of education in the big cities. And they're right. The quality of the education that we're providing to our students in big cities is not very good. And that's our responsibility. We need to figure out how to do this. And in order to figure it out, we have to experiment. We have to have different ways of trying different things in different places just to see what works. And so what we want to do, this was the AFT policy, this was Shanker, it was the first time he was talking about charter schools, and that's what he called them. The idea was to have schools in the big cities, and particularly in the inner cities, that would be free from some of the restrictions in the contract, that would allow for experimentation. And that experimentation would be controlled by the teachers themselves, who would learn through that process and through internal discussions within the AFT, what works and what doesn't work and what will improve education for these kids, because that really is our first responsibility. And I listened to that speech and I thought, that's right. That sounds right. And I was very impressed with the cogency and with the acceptance of the responsibility. But then, of course, the corporate world came in and jumped in and said, "Oh, charter school's great. We'll put the teachers aside. They don't know anything. We're going to do it, and we're going to be in charge." And then you get all the billionaires with their money making money off the charter schools and sort of pulling the resources away from public education and all the stuff that's wrong with charter schools. But if you go and you look at the history of it, it really originated inside the AFT with a self-criticism and an acknowledgement of the teacher's own responsibility for working this stuff out and having ideas about how to do it, not only organizationally with charter school, but substantively with pedagogical methods. So Shanker led that too, as well as being this arch anti-communist and vigorous anti-democrat within the organization and union.
Didn't you get thrown off the stage once or something?
No, I got pushed away from Mike.
Oh, okay. I thought someone got thrown off the stage.
Well, maybe, but it wasn't.
Maybe it was Judy. Yeah,
it wasn't me.
So were there times where you built coalitions with students and other unions on campus around an issue or a campaign or anything?
Well, we did certainly in the early days before there was a union around the war and around military research on campus. That was a very, very big question. Should the faculty and the institution be involved in Defense Department research, particularly classified research, where it's not subject to public scrutiny, it's not subject to collegial scrutiny. And so there was a whole campaign in the late 60s to get rid of Defense Department research and certainly to get rid of classified research, and we did. But boy, that was a big fight, and that was faculty and students together. When the graduate students tried to organize in the late 70s and into the 80s, I think there was, with what became GSEU, UUP opposed it. UUP wouldn't cooperate, didn't want that as a bargaining agent.
When you say UUP, you mean statewide organization, the chapter?
Statewide. Didn't want to cooperate. And that was Newland as president. And on this campus, I remember very clearly, I was just about the only faculty member who gave 100% support to the graduate students for organizing a union. Because the faculty, for faculty, the graduate students were their peons.
Yeah.
They're research assistants and they're doing the teaching and they're here to be mentored and they're here to develop collegial relationships and learn how to have collegial relationships in an academic environment. And what is this union? It's just introducing conflict. It's just introducing a barrier between the faculty and their advisees.
Easier to exploit them.
We're against that. Well, they didn't talk about it in terms, of course, of exploitation. They talked about it in terms of developing a collegial relationship, which, of course, management will say to their workforce, too. We want to cooperate here. Yeah. We don't want any third force in between. Yeah. And Amazon says we'll work directly with our employees. We're all family here. You're an associate. Yeah. You're not a worker, or whatever language they want to put to it. And that was kind of part of the argument that was going on there, too. And I remember that when GSEU was seeking recognition as a union, it was a question that went to PERB, the Public Employees Relations Board in Albany, and they had hearings on the question. And at that time, Larry Cohen was the head of District 1 of CWA, which was New York and UM. And I think Bob Master was also working there, and the attorney for District 1 for CWA was representing them up in Albany. David Mintz was his name. So I ended up cooperating with them, and I was a witness. I went up to Albany, and the question for PERB for the graduate students was, are they employees or are they students? If they're students, they have no right to collective bargaining. If they're employees, they do. So what's the answer? That's what they had to decide. And I was there to testify on behalf of the students that yes, they're students, but really for purposes that we're talking here, they're workers. And they have a legitimate claim to the protection of the elections. And that was ultimately what won the day. But there was a case where there was a very clear division between the academic union for the faculty and the graduate students who were seeking compensation. And I just sided with the grad students instead of them.
So was UUP at the table testifying that they're students?
I don't know.
But when you say there wasn't necessarily support, is it in that UUP wasn't going to help them with the unionization drive and publicly support it? It was just going to be publicly neutral or agnostic? Or?
I don't know what the UUP statewide did in those hearings. I know
there's the whole thing. I'm just curious.
I don't know.
Yeah. Well, you said that they were.
Well, they were opposed. They did not want the graduate students organizing, and they certainly didn't want to represent them or have them be part of our bargaining.
Yeah.
Now, what they did in other elements of testimony and or briefs that they filed or anything, I don't know. But I do remember that what I was told by the CWA people was that I was the only faculty member that testified on behalf of the grad students in those hearings. I was not told that there was a parade of people who testified against them. That I don't know. Can't say.
Yeah, because it's interesting because in Rutgers, the Rutgers faculty union has the graduate students in it. So but their staff are in a separate union. So it's a different construct. It's interesting. And in PSD CUNY, it's my understanding that the graduate students, the PhD students are part of PSD CUNY. So it's an interesting, our neighbor state in our own state and our union.
How these things happen, that's right.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Okay, so what were we talk about this sort of division. Were there times that you've observed over the years where academics and professionals were maybe not united in our union, and how did you kind of work to build unity amongst our diverse bargaining unit?
Well, that's a good question, and there's two questions. One on the campus around grievances, and the other statewide in relation to UUP's attitude towards AAU. So let me start with just on the campus. We get grievances from professional employees targeting the behavior of their department chairs. Well, the department chairs are also faculty members who are in our unit.
Yep.
So we go to the labor management meeting, or we go to HR and we say, look at this terrible behavior. We're representing this professional employee. And management says, well, yeah, but who's the griever? I mean, who's the target of your grievance? That's your people. That's your responsibility. You don't come to us with that. And we say, well, in their aspect as department chair, in their function in this dynamic, they're your people because they're management.
Yeah.
They're acting as managers. That's what it means to be in the middle class, right? You're in the middle of labor management, right? You're in the middle. And we go to them and we say, the reason why we have this problem is because you're not training department chairs how to be a department chair and respect the rights of their staff. That's your responsibility. That's not our responsibility. Our responsibility is to defend all of our members, including the department chair who we are here defending. Even though he's the target of this grievance, we're defending him against your lack of training. So that's one way in which this conflict emerges. And I think that's still very much the case. That's still very much the dynamic that often plays out.
Yeah.
And that's, it's complicated. So how do you deal with that? Well, you deal with that by calling it out.
Yeah.
And then also trying to work with our own faculty as the union and letting them know as department chairs or as senior faculty, this is what the rights are of professional employees. This is what the performance program has to look like. This is why you need to do it every year. This is why it has to be updated. This is why you have a responsibility to your own colleagues in the union. So we did that when I was vice president for academics. We would have those kinds of discussions and trainings and so on. But it's a tough thing.
It's hard to break down when higher education and academia has all of these hierarchies.
That's
right. It's a constant battle to uphold solidarity within our union, to be the countervailing force for those hierarchies of our workplace.
That's right. That's right.
Challenge.
It is a challenge, and the hierarchies are there. You can't wish them away because the fact is that department chair is the department chair.
Yeah.
And there are responsibilities that person has towards disciplining their own workforce, towards keeping records, towards promotions and decisions and all kinds of things.
Yeah.
But our view has always been when they are acting in that capacity, they're acting as management. And that's management's responsibility to train them, and we will help in that process.
Yeah.
But that's a conflict. That's a definite conflict. And it's especially sharply felt, of course, by the professionals, because they're get the butt end of it. Right? The academics can kind of tromp all over the professionals and not think they're doing anything peculiar at all.
Yeah.
Which is always the problem between the oppressor and the oppressed.
Walk a mile in my shoes.
Yeah, that kind of thing, and then you get some idea. So that's one example. The other example out of UUP history, again, goes back to Shorterman's days as president. There was an idea that we should merge our operations somehow more closely with AAUP. And Bill's thinking, and a lot of people's thinking, well, I agreed with it too. Unions are on the defensive. Higher education unions are on the defensive. We need to have as much legitimacy as we can muster. There's nothing more legitimate than the AAUP in its claims for in its defense for academic freedom. And they do now, which they didn't 50 years ago, engage in collective bargaining. So why don't we team up? And that happened. There was actually a decision that was made by UUP, but it was cleared through NYSET and AFT that UUP would pay for 1,000 memberships in AAUP, which is to say we would give them money to support their operation. And in exchange for that money, they would agree to give 1,000 memberships to our activists. So all the delegates and all the officers and all the chapter officers and chapter delegates, it didn't matter if you were in any position of authority or elected anything. In any UUP chapter or statewide, you became a member of AAUP. Terrific. But AAUP didn't have any experience with professional people. So the professionals in UUP were saying, wait a second, why are we spending on giving them, it was a lot of money. UUP would paid a third, NYSET paid a third, and AFT paid a third of that money that went to AAUP. To AAUP. But still, we were paying a third of that 1,000 membership. It was a lot of money. So our professionals were chafing and saying, wait a second, AAUP doesn't understand us at all. They don't. We walked into an AAUP meeting and they look at us and who the hell are you? What are you doing here?
There's no professional issues on the agenda.
No professional issues on the agenda, no professional issues of professional people in the room. They were all academics, which was, of course, the history of the AAUP, and it's a very fine, important tradition. So the question was, can AAUP change its culture? And there was a period of about 6 or 8 years where UUP professionals worked closely with AAUP staff and leadership in trying to sort out what it would mean for AAUP to take professionals seriously. And in the end, there was no satisfactory resolution. And so we ended that relationship. Now, I just read recently that the AFT and the AUP have merged their interests and have joint collective bargaining in different places, which was true for a time, but there's a tighter connection. So I don't know how they've resolved that question, but or maybe they haven't, and they just decided they're going to go ahead anyway. But that was another example of the differentiation between academic and professional in the operation of the union dynamics of the UUP, not only internally, but also externally.
Yeah, wow, very interesting. So I think we're going to have to stop it here for today, but we could absolutely do a part 2 conversation because there's so much more to discuss.
There is a lot more,
yes.
A lot more to do. I very much appreciate this opportunity.
Absolutely.
And now I can look at the camera and say, oh, we did a good thing here.
Yes.
And I appreciate this. And this kind of oral history is a very important thing to do.
Yes. It's very important for us to share our stories and to know our stories and to hear all sides, because some people get to publish a book, some people get to publish, the official record,
right.
But, we're a member-driven union. We should have a member's history as well.
Yeah. I totally agree with that. That's great. So thanks for pulling this all together, and we'll set another date and we'll continue.
All right. Thanks so much for your time.
Here you are.
Yes, indeed.